It was a day like any other in the courthouse. The sun was shining brightly outside, and the usual sounds of the busy city could be heard faintly in the background. People were rushing about, going in and out of the building, walking quickly as if they had somewhere important to be. It was just another Monday morning. Or, at least, that's what everyone thought. But this wasn't just any adoption hearing. This was her moment. Her name was Zuri. She was only 7 years old, but in that moment, she was about to change everything. In the crowded courtroom, the judge sat at the front, flipping through papers. The lawyers and social workers talked among themselves in quiet voices. Some parents who were looking to adopt were sitting anxiously, waiting for the hearing to begin. They had been through this before. This was just another case, just another day. They didn't know the storm that was quietly brewing, the quiet strength in a small girl sitting at the back of the room, clutching her hands in her lap. Zuri didn't look like much. She was small for her age, with dark brown skin and hair that was pulled back into tight braids. Her face was calm, but there was something in her eyes that made people look twice. There was a depth in her gaze, something that didn't belong in a child. Something beyond her years. If you looked closely, you could see it. The kind of eyes that had seen more than they should. But no one noticed. People whispered about her, not knowing what was hidden behind her quiet nature. Some said she was shy. Some said she was nervous about being adopted. Some even said she was strange. She hadn't said much all morning. She just sat there, quiet and still, her big brown eyes looking around the room. It was as if she was seeing something that no one else could. And they were right. Zuri was seeing things no one else could. The judge, a middle-aged woman with short, graying hair, glanced down at the papers in front of her. Her eyes flicked over the details of the case. She had seen hundreds of adoption hearings in her years as a judge. The paperwork, the forms, the social worker reports, they all seemed the same. A name, a family, a background check. Another family looking to adopt a child. Another child looking for a home. Zuri had been in the system for 2 years. She had been in foster homes, and each time she thought she had found a family, something had gone wrong. It was always the same. People would get close to her, say they loved her, promise they would take care of her, but then they would change their minds. Or something else would happen, and she would end up back in the system. The cycle repeated over and over. But today felt different. Maybe it was because this time, the family that was looking to adopt her seemed nice. They were older, kind-faced people who seemed genuinely kind and patient. They were the Morgans, a couple in their late 40s who had been trying to adopt for years. They had already adopted one child, but now they wanted to adopt Zuri. They seemed hopeful. But there was something about them that Zuri wasn't sure of. Something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Zuri looked around the courtroom, her gaze moving slowly from one person to the next. She noticed everything. The way the people whispered and looked at her, the way the judge flipped through the papers, the way the Morgans smiled and nodded. But it wasn't just the people in the room she noticed. Zuri had always been good at reading people. She had learned to trust her instincts. And today, something felt wrong. The Morgans were sitting at the front of the room, their hands folded neatly in their laps. Mrs. Morgan, a tall woman with short brown hair and glasses, was nervously tapping her fingers against the table. Mr. Morgan, a man with thinning hair and a soft, gentle voice, kept smiling reassuringly at her. He looked kind. Mrs. Morgan did too, but there was a hint of something Zuri couldn't place. Something behind her eyes. Something that didn't feel right. Zuri had learned to trust her instincts. And right now, her instincts were telling her that something was not as it seemed. She didn't know what it was, but she felt it deep inside her. The judge finally cleared her throat, bringing the room's attention back to her. "Let's begin," she said, her voice steady. She glanced at the adoption papers again and then looked up at the Morgans. "Mr. and Mrs. Morgan, is everything in order for this adoption?" "Yes, Your Honor," Mrs. Morgan replied quickly. "Everything is in order." The judge nodded, but Zuri could see the slight hesitation in her face. She didn't know why, but it felt like the judge was not entirely convinced. Zuri's eyes narrowed slightly. Something was off. But what? The lawyer for the Morgans, a tall woman with short hair and a serious expression, spoke next. "Zuri is a wonderful child. We've been meeting with her for months now. We've already talked with her social worker, and everything seems to be progressing well. We believe she will be a perfect fit for our family." She smiled as she looked at the Morgans. But Zuri didn't smile. She didn't speak. She simply watched. Her eyes flicked toward the judge again, and then back to the Morgans. The judge was still studying the papers in front of her, but her eyes seemed distant, almost distracted. The room buzzed with the usual energy of the courtroom. Lawyers were talking in quiet, professional voices. The case files shuffled, their pages turning with a soft rustle. Everyone seemed to be going through the motions of a normal adoption hearing. The hopeful parents sat nervously in their seats, glancing at their watches every few seconds, waiting for the process to move forward. They were nervous, but hopeful. This could be their chance to give a child a home. But in the back of the room, a little girl sat completely still. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, and her body didn't move, even as the sounds of the courtroom buzzed around her. Her name was Zuri, and she was the one everyone had forgotten to notice. Her large brown eyes were fixed on the judge, staring at her with an intensity that seemed out of place in a child so young. Zuri didn't smile, didn't shift in her seat. She didn't even blink as she stared at the woman who would decide her fate. There was something different about her. Something in the way she looked at the judge, like she knew something no one else knew. No one could see it, but it was there. There was a quiet power in her silence. It was as if she was watching the entire room carefully, studying each person, listening to every word. The lawyer for the adopting parents, Ms. Fletcher, smiled at the judge. She had a calm, practiced tone. She had said these words many times before in many other hearings. "Zuri's a sweet, bright little girl. I'm sure she'll be a perfect fit for the Morgan family." The Morgans nodded with nervous smiles. They were sitting near the front of the courtroom, their faces filled with hope. They were kind people, well-intentioned, and they had already adopted a child before. But Zuri had never been so sure about a family. She had been in the system for so long, had moved from place to place, and no family had ever been quite right for her. The judge glanced at Ms. Fletcher, then nodded, her eyes moving back to the papers in front of her. "Thank you, Ms. Fletcher," she said softly, her voice as steady as ever. But Zuri didn't move. She didn't shift her gaze from the judge, even when everyone else in the room did. There was something unsettling about the way she just sat there. No nervousness, no fidgeting. Just a quiet, steady focus. She seemed so calm, so in control, as if she knew exactly what was going to happen next. For a moment, the air felt heavy. It was a strange feeling, one that no one in the room could quite place. There was a silence, but it was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of something important about to happen. The silence of something being held back. Ms. Fletcher turned to the judge with a smile. "Zuri is a good girl. She's been through so much, but she's always been bright and full of promise. I believe she will fit in perfectly with the Morgans." Everyone nodded in agreement. Even the judge nodded slightly, though her eyes didn't leave Zuri. The tension in the air seemed to grow thicker, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Zuri hadn't said a word all day. Not one single word. She had sat there in perfect stillness, and it was almost like her silence was speaking louder than anything anyone could say. There was something unsettling about her quietness. But it wasn't just that. It was what she wasn't saying that made everyone uneasy. It was the feeling in the pit of their stomachs, the strange and growing sense that they had all missed something important. Something big. As the judge called the hearing to order, Zuri's stillness was almost eerie. She hadn't moved. She hadn't made a sound. And yet, there was something about her presence that seemed to demand attention. The way her eyes were fixed on the judge, as if she could see right through the surface of the situation. The lawyer for the Morgans, Ms. Fletcher, continued talking about adoption details, about the Morgans' background, about the social workers' reports, and about how well things had been progressing. But Zuri still didn't move. Still didn't speak. Still didn't look away. And that was when the tension in the room reached a new height. It wasn't because of anything Zuri had done, not yet. It was because of what everyone else had done, or rather, what they hadn't done. They hadn't noticed her. Not really. Zuri had been in the system for a long time. She had lived in many different homes, many different places. But she had learned how to hide the truth from people. She had learned how to stay quiet, how to go unnoticed, how to fade into the background. But today, things were different. She wasn't just going to be another quiet, forgotten child. She wasn't going to let anyone decide her future without knowing the truth. The judge, still looking at the papers in front of her, seemed unaware of the shift in the room. She looked up at Ms. Fletcher and nodded. "Everything seems in order, Ms. Fletcher," she said, but her voice had a distant, almost distracted tone. It was as if her mind wasn't entirely focused on the case at hand. Zuri didn't take her eyes off the judge. She could feel the weight of the room's attention. It was like everyone else was waiting for her to do something, waiting for her to break the silence, to speak, to say anything. But Zuri wasn't ready yet. She wasn't ready to speak, not yet. But she knew something was about to happen. She could feel it in the air. She could feel the change coming. It wasn't going to be another boring, normal adoption hearing. As the hearing continued, the room was filled with the soft sounds of papers being shuffled, pens clicking, and murmurs of approval from the adopting parents. Ms. Fletcher, the lawyer for the Morgans, spoke in her calm, practiced tone, as she always did. Her voice was smooth and soothing, like a lullaby meant to calm any nerves in the room. She went over the adoption papers, the formalities, the questions that everyone knew would come. She spoke about Zuri's background, her time in foster care, and how much the Morgans wanted to provide a loving home for her. Her words were warm and convincing, and the Morgans sat in front of the judge, their faces bright with hope. They were excited about the possibility of finally bringing Zuri into their family. They smiled at each other, barely able to hide their enthusiasm. Zuri, however, was a stark contrast. She remained still, her hands still folded in her lap. Her large brown eyes never left the judge. It was almost as if she could see something others couldn't. Something about the way she watched the judge, so intensely, so focused, made everyone in the room feel uneasy. No one knew why, but they couldn't shake the feeling that Zuri was about to do something important. As the minutes passed, the tension in the room grew. It wasn't the kind of tension you could see, but it was there. It was a quiet kind of tension, the kind that built up slowly, layer by layer, until it felt like something big was going to happen. Ms. Fletcher continued speaking about the formalities of the case, but Zuri's gaze didn't move. She didn't blink. She didn't even look at the Morgans, who were sitting eagerly in front. It was as if Zuri had forgotten they were even there. Her whole world seemed to be focused on the judge. The judge, still flipping through papers, didn't seem to notice the change in the room. She was focused on the paperwork, on the details of the case. She asked the usual questions, the ones she had asked in hundreds of other hearings. "Do you have any concerns, Ms. Fletcher? Are there any issues with the adoption process? Ms. Fletcher smiled politely and shook her head. "No concerns at all, Your Honor. Everything is in order." The judge nodded, but her eyes flickered briefly to Zuri. That was when the atmosphere in the room shifted, even more than before. Zuri's lips trembled, just the slightest bit, but it was enough to catch the attention of everyone in the room. Her face remained calm, but there was something about the way her lips trembled that made the room feel even quieter. Everyone could feel it. The air was thick with expectation. Zuri didn't speak, not at first. But then, just as the judge was about to speak again, Zuri took a small, shaky breath. The sound was barely audible, but in the silence of the room, it seemed as loud as a thunderclap. Zuri's eyes fluttered for a moment, but then she took another breath, a deep, shaky one. Finally, she whispered, her voice so soft it was barely above a breath. "Help." The room went completely silent. For a few moments, no one moved. The sound of Zuri's word hung in the air like a thick fog, settling over everyone in the courtroom. It was as if the whole room had stopped functioning for a moment, caught in that one small word. Zuri's gaze remained steady, her eyes now locked on the judge. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She was still. But the tension in the room was unbearable now, as if something unseen was slowly creeping toward everyone, something they weren't prepared for. The judge's face changed instantly. The calm, composed expression she had worn for the entire hearing cracked for just a moment. She blinked, a slight crease appearing on her forehead. Then, she quickly turned her gaze toward the court officer standing nearby, her voice shaky now, something unspoken flashing across her face. "Call 911, the judge said, her voice unsteady, just barely above a whisper. The officer hesitated, looking at the judge for confirmation. But there was no mistaking the command. The judge's voice had a weight to it now, a sense of urgency that made the officer spring into action. The officer moved swiftly to the phone, dialing the emergency number with quick, practiced fingers. The hum of the phone line was the only sound in the room as the officer spoke briefly, giving instructions about the location of the courthouse. But no one knew why the judge had ordered it. No one knew what had caused her to suddenly call for help. Zuri's eyes never wavered from the judge. Her face remained the same, calm and focused. But the room was no longer the same. The calm atmosphere had been replaced by something darker, something heavier. The Morgans, still sitting in front, exchanged confused glances. They didn't know what was happening, but they could feel the shift. They could feel the change, like a ripple in the air. The smiles that had once been so bright on their faces slowly faded, replaced by nervous uncertainty. The lawyer, Ms. Fletcher, stood frozen for a moment, her mouth slightly open, but she said nothing. She had no idea what had just happened, but she could feel the change in the air. It was like a switch had been flipped, and everything was suddenly different. The judge cleared her throat, her hand resting on the desk in front of her. She glanced down at Zuri again, then back to the officer who had just finished speaking with 911. The officer nodded once, then stood by the door, waiting for further instructions. Zuri didn't speak again. She didn't move. She just watched. For the next few moments, the room was in chaos. The judge spoke quietly but urgently to the officer, her words a mix of concern and confusion. "Keep the room calm," she instructed. "We don't know what we're dealing with here." But no one in the room knew what was happening. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. The tension that had been building all morning was now at its peak. The silence in the courtroom grew thicker with every passing second. No one moved. Everyone seemed frozen in place. The air felt colder now, as if the room itself was holding its breath. The tension that had built up so quietly, so carefully, now exploded into full force. Then, without warning, the courtroom door swung open. The sound of the door crashing against the wall seemed to echo throughout the room. A team of paramedics rushed in, moving quickly, scanning the crowd with sharp eyes. The bright red uniforms of the paramedics stood in stark contrast to the quiet, tense atmosphere of the room. The judge, who had been standing calmly at the bench, suddenly stood up, her posture rigid, her voice commanding. She looked around, her eyes searching for something or someone. "Where is she?" the judge asked sharply. Her voice cut through the room like a knife. Zuri didn't move from her seat. She didn't even blink. Her tiny frame remained still, as if she was made of stone. But then, slowly, she lifted one hand, her finger pointing toward the back of the courtroom. The finger pointed directly at Miss Fletcher. Miss Fletcher, who had been standing near the table, her hands clasped nervously in front of her, suddenly went pale. Her face drained of color, as if all the blood had rushed out of it. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The words seemed to get stuck in her throat, lost in the sudden, unbearable tension that filled the room. The paramedics moved quickly toward her, their movements purposeful but shaky, as if they weren't entirely sure what was happening either. They reached Miss Fletcher in just a few steps, their hands reaching out to her as they spoke in hurried tones. You need to come with us," one of the paramedics said, his voice strained with urgency. Miss Fletcher didn't respond. She simply stared at the paramedics with wide eyes, her mouth opening and closing, as though she was trying to understand what was happening. But before she could say anything, the paramedics grabbed her by the arms, leading her away from the table and toward the exit. The room was completely still. Not a sound was made. The quiet was so profound that it was almost deafening. The people in the courtroom watched in shock as Miss Fletcher was pulled away, unable to process the situation. No one moved. They didn't know what to do. The tension in the room was unbearable. It was as if time itself had slowed down. The room seemed to grow colder with every passing second, and yet no one dared to speak. Everyone was too afraid of what might happen next, too afraid of what they might discover. As Miss Fletcher was led toward the door, her legs wobbling beneath her, her expression was one of complete confusion. She looked back at the crowd, her eyes filled with disbelief. She didn't understand what was happening. Why had she been singled out? What did Zuri know that no one else did? Zuri remained seated, her small body still as a statue, her gaze never leaving the judge. The paramedics continued to lead Miss Fletcher out of the courtroom, her face growing paler with every step. And then, just before she disappeared through the door, Zuri's voice broke the silence once more. Her voice was calm, soft, yet it seemed to echo through the room, carrying a weight of truth that none of them had been prepared for. "She's not who you think she is." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, filling every corner of the courtroom. They were simple words, but their impact was immediate. Every person in the room felt it. They felt the weight of those words pressing down on them, demanding that they pay attention, that they listen, that they understand. For a moment, no one spoke. No one moved. The room was so quiet that even the sound of a pin dropping would have seemed deafening. Everyone's eyes turned to Zuri, as if they were waiting for her to say more, to explain what she meant. But Zuri didn't speak again. She simply sat there, her small figure a sharp contrast to the chaos unfolding around her. She didn't need to say anything else. The single sentence she had spoken was enough to change everything. The paramedics, who had been so sure of their mission, hesitated for a brief moment. They looked at each other, unsure of what to do next. But Zuri's words had already set the stage. They had already shifted the balance of the room. Miss Fletcher, now being escorted out of the room, looked back one last time, her eyes wide with fear. It was clear that she was terrified, but not because of the paramedics. No, it was something else, something much deeper. She was afraid of Zuri, afraid of what she had said, and afraid of what would happen next. The judge, who had been standing silently by her bench, finally spoke again. But her voice was different now. It was no longer calm and measured. It was urgent, filled with disbelief. "Someone explain to me what's going on here," the judge demanded, her voice rising. What did she mean by that? Why was Ms. Fletcher taken away? And why did Zuri say those words? No one answered. The room was still too stunned to react. The Morgans sat frozen in their seats, their hands clasped tightly in their laps, unsure of what to do. The court officers stood in place, watching the events unfold with wide eyes, unable to take action. Zuri, however, remained still. Her eyes never left the judge's, as though she was waiting for the next part of the story to unfold. She knew something that no one else did, and that knowledge was powerful. She didn't need to speak anymore. Her silence was enough. The paramedics had now reached the door, but they didn't leave. They stood at the threshold, waiting for further instructions. No one moved, not even them. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath. Finally, the judge looked down at the papers in front of her, as if she was trying to make sense of the situation. But it wasn't just the papers that needed attention. It was the mystery at the heart of it all. Zuri's words had changed everything. And now, the real story was beginning to unfold. The judge's voice, shaky but determined, broke through the silence once again. "Zuri," she said, her voice softer now, as though she was trying to make sense of the impossible. "What did you mean? What do you know?" Zuri didn't answer right away. She simply looked at the judge with those large, dark eyes, as though she could see right through her. It was a gaze filled with knowledge that had been hidden for far too long. Finally, Zuri spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper, but it was enough. "She's not who you think she is," Zuri repeated. "She's not a lawyer. She's something else." The room froze again. The air seemed to freeze along with it. What Zuri had just said was more than a simple statement. It was an accusation, a revelation, a warning. And the truth, it seemed, was just beginning to emerge. The tension in the courtroom was thick, like a storm waiting to break. As the paramedics led Ms. Fletcher out of the room, the crowd remained frozen in place. No one spoke. The only sound was the soft shuffle of the paramedics' feet on the smooth floor, their movements quick but careful, almost as if they too were afraid to disturb the fragile stillness in the air. Zuri's small figure remained unmoved. Her eyes, still fixed on the judge, seemed to be the only thing in the room that held any certainty. She didn't look away. She didn't shift in her seat. The weight of her gaze seemed to command attention from everyone in the room. The Morgans, who had been so hopeful only moments before, were now sitting in stunned silence. They were trying to make sense of what had just happened, trying to piece together the puzzle that had unfolded before them. Their faces were filled with confusion, disbelief, and a growing sense of realization. Slowly, they began to understand. Zuri hadn't just been quiet. She hadn't been withdrawn or scared. No, Zuri had been watching, listening, and waiting. She had seen something in Ms. Fletcher, something that the rest of them had missed. And now, that secret was out. As the door closed behind the paramedics, the judge stood tall behind her bench, her expression hard and resolute. She was no longer the calm figure who had been presiding over a simple adoption hearing. Now, she was a leader, someone who was ready to take action. The truth was clear, and there was no more room for hesitation. "Everyone, please stay in your seats," the judge commanded, her voice steady and firm. "We will get to the bottom of this. No one leaves until we understand exactly what has happened here." The room was eerily quiet. The usual hum of whispers, the shuffle of feet, the rustle of papers, everything had disappeared. No one dared to make a sound. They were all waiting for the next step. The judge looked down at her notes, flipping through the pages with swift fingers. She knew that things were about to get very serious. She knew that the lies that had been built around this adoption case were about to come crashing down. But even as she prepared for the next steps, her mind kept coming back to Zuri. That quiet little girl, who had seen through everything, who had been the key to uncovering the truth. "Zuri," the judge said, her voice softer now. "You've done something very important today. You've saved not just your own life, but the lives of many others. You have my deepest respect." Zuri didn't smile, but there was a shift in her eyes. It was a look of quiet understanding, a look that seemed to say that she didn't need anyone's praise. She had done what she knew was right. And in that moment, she had taken control of her own destiny. As the judge continued, her words carried a weight that none of them had expected. "It has come to our attention that Ms. Fletcher has been involved in a series of fraudulent adoptions. She has been exploiting children like Zuri, using her position of power to take advantage of vulnerable families. This is a crime. And it will not be tolerated." The room erupted into murmurs, the shock and disbelief clear on everyone's faces. They had all thought Ms. Fletcher was just another professional in the system, someone there to help children find their forever homes. But now, they understood that they had been wrong. They had been misled by someone who had hidden behind a facade of trust and professionalism. Zuri's eyes never left the judge as the gravity of the situation sank in. She had been right all along. She had known what Ms. Fletcher was capable of, and now, with a single word, she had exposed her. Zuri hadn't just been quiet, she had been watching, waiting for the right moment to speak. And when she did speak, her words had been powerful enough to change everything. "The truth is," the judge continued, her voice unwavering, "Ms. Fletcher has been part of a larger scheme. She has been using her position to arrange fraudulent adoptions, taking children from families who trusted her and placing them in unsafe situations. This has gone on for far too long." As the judge spoke, the room became more and more still. No one spoke. No one moved. They were all processing what they had just heard. How could this happen? How could someone so trusted, someone who was supposed to help children, have been responsible for such terrible acts? But then, the judge's eyes shifted back to Zuri. She took a deep breath before speaking again. "Zuri, you are a brave young girl. You've seen things that others couldn't see, and you've done something that many adults would have been too afraid to do. Your courage has saved lives today. Because of you, we are able to stop this criminal from hurting any more children." Zuri's expression didn't change, but her posture seemed to relax slightly. She wasn't looking for praise. She wasn't looking for recognition. She had done what needed to be done. And now, it was over. The Morgans, still sitting in shock, exchanged glances. They had been part of something much larger than they had realized. They had come into this hearing hoping to adopt a child, to bring a new member into their family. But what they had stumbled upon was far darker. As the judge called for the authorities to take control of the situation, Zuri stood up. Her eyes never left the judge. There was no fear in her gaze, only a quiet understanding that the truth had been revealed and justice was being served. The police arrived shortly afterward, their presence adding a new level of tension to the room. They moved quickly, making their way toward the door where Ms. Fletcher had been escorted. The air felt charged, as if something significant was about to happen. Zuri didn't flinch as the police officers passed her. She didn't seem to notice them at all. Her attention remained fixed on the judge, as though everything else in the room had faded into the background. But then, something extraordinary happened. As the police officers moved to apprehend Ms. Fletcher, Zuri spoke once more. "She won't hurt anyone again," Zuri said, her voice calm but firm. And in that moment, everyone understood. Zuri had saved them all. She had seen the danger that no one else had noticed, and she had taken action. Without her, the truth might have remained hidden for much longer. But because of her courage, because of her strength, the cycle of harm had been stopped. The judge nodded slowly, her eyes filled with admiration. "You're right, Zuri," she said. "You've done something that most adults would never have the courage to do. You've given us all a chance to make things right." Zuri's gaze softened just a little. She wasn't looking for praise or recognition. She didn't need anyone to tell her she had done something extraordinary. She already knew. In her quiet way, she had taken control of her own story, and in doing so, she had changed the lives of everyone around her. As the police officers took Miss Fletcher away, the room remained silent. No one moved. They were all reflecting on the events that had unfolded, processing the shock, the disbelief, and the realization that they had witnessed something truly remarkable. And as Zuri stood there, still and quiet, the judge made one final statement. "We will make sure that justice is served. And Zuri, you will never be overlooked again." Zuri didn't respond, but her eyes seemed to say it all. She didn't need words to understand that her life was about to change. And as she stood there, in the calm after the storm, she knew that she had done what needed to be done. As the last of the people filed out of the courtroom, Zuri stood there for a moment, taking in the quiet. The room, which had once been filled with tension and confusion, was now calm. People moved in a steady stream toward the doors, but Zuri stayed in place, her small figure seeming to take in everything around her. Zuri had always been quiet. She had always been the one who stayed in the background, observing, listening. She had never been one to seek attention or to stand out. And yet, today, in this courtroom, she had done something that no one had expected. She had spoken one word, just one, and it had changed everything. Her word had shattered the silence. It had been a simple request, a cry for help, but it had carried so much weight. It had made people listen. It had made them stop and pay attention. And in that moment, everything had changed. As she walked out of the courtroom, her hand in her new mother's, Zuri felt different. She wasn't just a quiet little girl anymore. She was a symbol of strength. A symbol of courage. A reminder that sometimes, the smallest voices have the greatest power. Zuri's journey wasn't over yet. She still had a long road ahead of her, a road that would have its ups and downs. But today, she had proven something important, something that would stay with her for the rest of her life. She had proven that even when people overlook you, even when they think you don't have a voice, you can still make a difference. You can still change things. As Zuri stepped outside the courthouse, the sun was shining brightly. It was a new day, and the world seemed to be waiting for her. Her new family, the Morgans, stood beside her, their faces filled with warmth and pride. They had been part of something important today, something that went beyond an adoption. They had witnessed Zuri's bravery. They had seen the quiet strength that she had carried with her all along. Zuri glanced up at them, her small face serious but calm. She didn't need to speak. She didn't need to say anything at all. Her eyes told them everything they needed to know. She had found her place. She had found her family. And in that moment, she knew that no matter what the future held, she would be okay. Her new parents smiled down at her, their faces filled with love. They had seen what she had done today, and they knew how special she was. They knew that Zuri was more than just a child they were adopting. She was someone who had shown them what true courage looked like. She was someone who had proven that you don't need to be loud or strong to make a difference. Sometimes, just being true to yourself, and having the courage to speak up when it matters most, is enough. Zuri didn't smile, but there was a softness in her eyes that spoke volumes. She had made it through the hardest part. She had faced fear and uncertainty, but she had never let it control her. She had stood up when it mattered, and in doing so, she had changed the lives of everyone around her. She had reminded them that courage comes in many forms. It doesn't always look like someone who is strong and loud. Sometimes, it looks like a small girl, sitting quietly in the back of the room, waiting for the right moment to speak. As they walked together, Zuri held her new mother's hand tightly. It wasn't the first time she had been in a courtroom, but it was the first time she had ever felt like she belonged somewhere. She had always been just a quiet child, an observer. But now, she was a part of something. She was part of a family. And that was a feeling that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. The Morgans had no idea just how much Zuri had already been through. They didn't know the full story of what had happened to her in the past, the things she had witnessed, the things she had survived. But that didn't matter. What mattered now was that they were together. What mattered now was that Zuri had a place where she was safe, where she could grow, and where she could find her voice. As they drove away from the courthouse, Zuri looked out the window. The world outside was busy and noisy, full of people rushing from one place to another. But inside the car, it was peaceful. She was with her new family. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had a place where she could truly be herself. Her new father glanced back at her from the front seat, his face soft with a quiet smile. "We're proud of you, Zuri," he said. "You did something today that most people could never do. You spoke up when it mattered. You showed us what true strength looks like." Zuri didn't respond, but she didn't need to. The smile that touched her lips was enough. She was proud of herself, too. She had done something important today. She had spoken up, and in doing so, she had shown everyone around her just how powerful one small voice could be. The rest of the drive was quiet, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that comes when you're with people who understand you, people who accept you for who you are. Zuri had always been a quiet girl, but now, in this new family, she didn't feel like she had to hide her thoughts or her feelings. She felt safe. She felt loved. And most of all, she felt like she belonged. When they arrived at their new home, Zuri stepped out of the car and looked up at the house. It was a small house, but it was warm and inviting, with flowers in the front yard and a big oak tree in the backyard. It felt like the kind of place where a child could grow up happy. It felt like the kind of place where Zuri could finally be herself. She stood there for a moment, taking it all in. The world around her seemed different now. It wasn't the same world that she had known before, a world filled with fear and uncertainty. Now, it was a world full of possibilities. A world where she had a family who cared for her, who would protect her, and who would help her grow. As she stepped inside the house, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. This was her new home. And even though it had been a long, difficult journey to get here, Zuri knew that it had all been worth it. There would be challenges ahead. There would be days when she felt uncertain, days when she struggled to find her place in the world. But Zuri knew that she was strong enough to face whatever came her way. She had already proven that. She had already shown that, even in the most difficult of situations, one small word could change everything. And as she sat down at the kitchen table with her new family, Zuri smiled quietly to herself. She had found her voice. She had found her family. And she knew that, no matter what happened next, she would never be invisible again.